Yes, so thank you very much for having me, and I'll talk about the future development agenda and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and what they can gain from Nexus thinking. And at SEI we've begun to explore this as we found it worrying that many SDGs proposal had begun to develop along the traditional sectoral lines. And I would first like to revisit why meeting the ambition and scope of the SDGs requires recognition to interlinkages across sectors. And after that, I'll move into how Nexus thinking can help to bring interactions to light and support development of more integrated goals. So the Millennium Development Goals, they laid out an agenda to improve living conditions in poor countries. And now the Sustainable Development Goals suggest a broader and more ambitious agenda with the overarching aim to keep people out of poverty in the long term. And this is to be achieved by addressing root causes of poverty and how human societies interact with each other and with the planet. And long-term sustainability requires acknowledging that many of the resources that support development are finite and also needed for ecosystem services. And to address today's development challenges, the social, economic, and environmental interest must be balanced. It also requires consideration to how resources and materials move from local to global scales. And in an interlinked and globalized world, collective action and a burden sharing strategy that goes beyond the traditional donor-recipient model is also needed. And for the SDGs, the aim is to arrive at a set of goals that engages countries at all income levels, but under which action can be adapted to country contexts. So change needs to happen in rich countries as much as in the poor. And development can only be sustainable if it works within those constraints over time and scales and sectors. But the Millennium Development Goals arguably fell short in this regard. They identified sectoral goals and targets under them that gave little consideration to how efforts to attain a goal in one sector would affect or be affected by efforts in another sector, and also whether the total demand for key resources could be met by existing supplies without degrading the resource base. Considering the many types of interlinkages, meeting the ambition of the SDGs is arguably impossible without coordination and collaboration. Without it, there is a risk that actions on SDGs are contradictory or inefficient, and that we miss out on smart solutions and cost-efficient alternatives that could benefit more. The Rio Plus 20 document already highlighted that the SDGs had to address interlinkages between different areas, and the open working group that was tasked to propose a set of goals also considered different opportunities for integration, but they seem to have fallen short in using them in their final proposal. The open working group has proposed the following targets for water, energy, and food. The goal for ending hunger, achieving food security, and sustainable agriculture focuses on access to food, agricultural productivity, and sustainable food production systems. It also sets the target for genetic diversity and resources. The energy goal also focuses on access and efficiency and on increasing the share of renewable energy. The water goal likewise focuses on access to drinking water, sanitation and hygiene, improving water quality and increasing water use efficiency. It also sets a target for integrated water resources management and one for protection of water-related ecosystems. And a quick look at these targets makes evident that most of them are likely to have implications for targets that sit under other goals and for each other, but the proposal doesn't make any cross-referencing between targets to highlight that they are interlinked, nor does it communicate that implementation must respect how targets rely on the same finite resources. In fact, interlinkages between targets were highlighted in an earlier version of the Open Working Group's proposal, but were left out in the outcome document. And this reflects a missed opportunity by the Open Working Group to communicate and inspire systems thinking and cross-sector collaboration in both planning and implementing the SDGs. The energy, food, and water goals are also examples of a goal framework that is structured along the lines of traditional sectors. And from a Nexus perspective, it's potentially risky that food and energy are dealt with in sectoral goals without recognition to how they rely on the same resources. Other goals, for example, the one on sustainable consumption and production, does a much better job in reflecting systems thinking. This is so because it doesn't focus on a specific sector's interests, but on a systemic barrier to sustainable development. And the SCP target focuses on sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources, which obviously links in many other sectors, like food and agricultural practices and energy and water management. And this goal also focuses on supply chains and life cycles, which makes the case for a universal agenda. It's all connected, but different parts will contribute in different ways and in different circumstances. But this type of goal is an exception in the framework. And it looks like the SDG drafters and member states are in need of analytical tools and practical guidance on how to handle the interactions in the framework, both in shaping the actual framework and for guiding implementation at country level. And Nexus thinking seems to offer a useful framework for this. It's actually based on the same guiding principles. They both aim to ensure access to resources for the most vulnerable, to promote efficiency in resource use, and to ensure sustainability. And the focus on these three areas is also clearly reflected in the three goals that I had just shown. Nexus analysis can help to spot interactions between different sector objectives and clarify how they share interests in the same resources. This enables us to assess the total pressure on a resource that result from several targets, and therefore if the framework is sustainable when action on individual targets add up. And by analyzing interactions this way, a Nexus assessment of the proposed targets can help us avoid a situation where in the final framework targets are conflicting or overlapping, and we can also identify potential synergies between goals that suggest win-win solutions and more cost-efficient alternatives. But how Nexus interactions play out are context-specific, as we have seen and heard already, and countries will face different trade-offs and synergies between the targets, depending on resource availability, demand, and socioeconomic circumstances. So at the global level, the assessment of the goals framework can be based on generally known interactions and trends to highlight key areas of both opportunity and concern. But at the local level, where resource availability and priorities are known in detail, it can also guide decision-making on how to best allocate resources and consequently which targets that would be more efficient for that specific country to focus on, as well as setting the reasonable level of ambition. The formulation and prioritization of targets should therefore take place at the scale where action will be taken and where data can be gathered. The globally proposed targets could therefore be seen as building blocks that each country will combine in its own way, balancing the needs for access, efficiency, and sustainability in a way that is actionable in that context. But on a global scale, all three types of targets are essential to the success and sustainability of the SDGs, as they are closely linked. Efforts to ensure access must be combined with efficient resource use in order for outcomes to be sustainable. We've explored three practical Nexus approaches that could support the SDG process. And the first is simply to identify to what extent targets are cross-sectoral and if they interconnect with other targets. Secondly, it's to help understand how the achievement of targets under one goal might affect targets under another goal, or how individual targets might serve multiple goals. And this would reveal the potential trade-offs and synergies and conflicts within the framework. Thirdly, we have let it serve as a tool for finding entry points for developing an integrated framework that also extends beyond the water, energy, and food security areas. So looking again at the proposed water, energy, and food targets, most have implications for targets under other goals. And some suggest critical trade-offs, for example, between food security and renewable energy. Others narrow down options for how targets can be achieved, for example, that energy should come from renewable sources. But many also suggest synergies as they contribute to the same objectives, for example, improved water and energy efficiency and increased agricultural productivity. So there is certainly potential for finding solutions that contribute to the achievement of several goals simultaneously, as well as developing shared indicators. Again, as the Nexus interactions are context-specific, a more detailed assessment of the interactions is problematic at this scale, and the interactions on the screen are only illustrative. But targets on resource efficiency and sustainability are certainly relevant from a Nexus perspective, as they could reduce pressures and help to avoid trade-offs. This is a sketch of the third approach. It suggests that instead of setting targets according to sector interests and then look for interactions with other targets, to take off from one sector, it could be anyone, and link in more and more issues or uses. This way we can map out the multiple demands for a resource and identify linking targets at the nexus of different sectors. For example, energy is needed for water pumping, and water is needed for both hydropower and thermal power production. And around the nexus, in between sectors, is where we could build goals that address sustainability and efficiency, and targets that would truly encourage cross-sector collaboration and coordinated action, and possibly create an integrated SDG framework. Beyond the water, energy, and food, this figure also includes the resources as enablers for social sectors. For example, energy is crucial to achieve both health and education targets. And the sketch could be extended to a comprehensive map of all SDG areas, which may sound like an mission impossible. And it certainly becomes complex as we keep drawing in linkages, but it's important to note that we're only highlighting complexities that already exist and not creating any new ones. Instead, I would argue that by proactively addressing complexities in the formulation, a more concise SDG framework with more robust solutions can be produced, as the redundancies and contradictions have been identified and addressed in the process. It could therefore help us arrive at a framework that is more easily communicated and less overwhelming. The process itself could also support more effective negotiations, as it enables countries and sectors to see more clearly where their interests coincide, where they diverge, and how they might overcome their differences. These three approaches are meant to serve as a starting point for visualizing and exploring a more integrated approach to the SDGs and its implementations. And for reasons I have pointed out, such integrated targets will need to be defined at the level of action, where trade-offs can be quantified and priorities made. And there are a number of methods available for quantifying the linkages. The most appropriate to use depends on, for example, the scale and the goal of the assessment and the capacity and trust among stakeholders, as well as data availability. And SEI has implemented a number of Nexus projects using both quantitative and qualitative methods. And an ongoing project in the Upper Blue Nile has also moved to integrate several tools into a Nexus toolbox. I will not give much detail on this specific tools, as I have not worked with them myself yet, but the project serves as a good example of how Nexus thinking can support planners at country level to make progress towards a vision for sustainable development, which is relevant whether the vision comes from a country process or from the UN. What they've done is to set up a Nexus platform at the source of the Blue Nile to develop and analyze different scenarios for development and resource use. And researchers and stakeholders have jointly created those scenarios and can then quantify the links between sectors, for example, the energy requirements for agriculture, by using the integrated toolbox. And the results have illustrated both trade-offs between interests and opportunities for improved management, and also highlighted the need to bridge institutions and benefit sharing across sectors and scales. And this is one of many examples of how Nexus analysis conducted at the appropriate level with the appropriate methods and tools can provide decision makers with information that can support more efficient, equitable, and sustainable development pathways. With a year to go before the target for adoption, there is definitely scope for improving the way in which the SDG frameworks enables action on the interlinked development challenges that it sets out to address. The global framework is most likely not the appropriate level to address Nexus challenges, but it needs to make a better platform for integrated solutions and communicate the need for coordinated action across scales. A key issue as the SDG process moves forward will therefore be to connect the global SDG process with existing country-level policy processes and establishing the links between them. Many opportunities will emerge, for example, as the SDG discussions move to implementation mechanisms and partnerships, because the implementation of integrated targets would challenge current structures of government and operation of other sector-based agencies, as well as funding arrangements. And making this shift will be challenging, but is arguably needed if the SDGs are to meet their ambition and bring about genuinely transformative change. I will stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay.